So in contrast to the modulatory neurotransmitters that everybody kind of knows the names of, like dopamine and norepinephrine and serotonin and acetylcholine, the amino acid neurotransmitters are by far the most abundant neurotransmitters in our brains. And glutamate is the primary excitatory neurotransmitter. That means it acts at ionotropic receptors, and there's a whole host of them. There's the AMPA, ionotropic glutamate receptor. There's the kainate ionotropic glutamate receptor. There's also the NMDA ionotropic glutamate receptor. And they differ in terms of, what kind of channel that they actually open. And remember, AMPA is another chemical, right, that will selectively activate only the AMPA glutamate receptors. Kainate is another chemical that will selectively activate only, the kainate glutamate receptors. And NMDA is yet another chemical that will only activate the NMDA glutamate receptors. And yet glutamate, of course, will act at all of its ionotropic receptors and open up all the channels. There's a lot to be said about these glutamate receptors, and in other classes we go into far more detail. But just so you have a sense that these are excitatory, actions, right, on via these ionotropic receptors. So they open depolarizing currents. So the AMPA and the kainate glutamate receptors have a channel that opens in response to binding of glutamate. That allows for sodium to pass through and depolarize a cell. So that's, really important for fast excitatory neurotransmission. And the NMDA receptor, glutamate receptor, is ionotropic, and it opens a channel that lets both sodium and a very potent and important ion, calcium, enter. And it only does so. It's very interesting, and there's a lot more to talk about NMDA, but it only does so under high levels of stimulation, when there's already been a lot of AMPA and kainate opening and a lot of depolarization that's occurring. The NMDA receptor under those circumstances is active and allows for calcium entry, which can set off all of these biochemical cascades in the postsynaptic cell and change gene expression and really, it turns out, strengthen synaptic connections. So glutamate is really important for altering synaptic connectivity under circumstances where there's a lot of excitatory activity, like unusual levels of excitatory activity. Something's happening, and there's a change in the amount of stimulation. Well, then the NMDA receptors come into play and allow for calcium entry and changes in gene expression and strengthening of these connections. It's something called long-term potentiation, or LTP. So glutamate, most abundant excitatory neurotransmitter in the brain, depolarizes, responsible for fast excitatory neurotransmission. There are metabotropic receptors for glutamate as well. And glutamate is not the only amino acid neurotransmitter that is having an excitatory impact, acting at ionotropic receptors that open depolarizing currents. Aspartate is actually another amino acid neurotransmitter that's being investigated now as well. Now, GABA, in contrast, is our primary inhibitory neurotransmitter, which acts at ionotropic receptors. These are GABA-A receptors, and the GABA-A receptor has a chloride channel. So chloride, can enter, upon GABA binding, and and it will hyperpolarize, the cell. It'll act, to rapidly inhibit neurotransmission. So GABA is our primary inhibitory neurotransmitter in contrast to glutamate. And it's because it acts at these ionotropic GABA-A receptors that'll open chloride channels, allowing chloride to enter the postsynaptic cell and hyperpolarizing, taking the neuron farther away, from the depolarized threshold value of minus 55. There are GABA-B metabotropic receptors as well. And as with glutamate, there are more amino acids that actually also act in our brains at ionotropic receptors to open, channels to inhibit, neuron firing. And glycine is another inhibitory amino acid neurotransmitter. So again, the most abundant neurotransmitters in the brain are not dopamine or serotonin or, acetylcholine or norepinephrine, but they are rather these amino acid neurotransmitters, glutamate and GABA. Glutamate is our primary excitatory neurotransmitter because it acts at receptors that open depolarizing, currents, channels. for sodium, and in some cases sodium and calcium. And GABA is the primary inhibitory neurotransmitter because it's opening channels or pores that let chloride pass through, and that has a hyperpolarizing and inhibitory effect.